What is it that makes the British seaside sinister? Why does it seem to attract so many killers? Is it the fact that the tide washes away their sins? Is it the fact that it's the end of the line? There's nothing overly frightening about a big wheel or a carousel. But what is undeniable is that the British seaside attracts and has always attracted death and murder. Hello, I'm Geoffrey Wansell. I write about crime, true crime. And in this new series, I want you to join me on a journey to the cliff's edge, where land meets the sea and where life meets death.
Whilst some may consider my opinions to be bold, they have been formed after writing bestsellers about killers for the past 30 years and staring evil in the face.
For make no mistake, there is something sinister about our British seaside towns. On the surface, they're all funfairs, candy floss and breezy promenades. But by digging a little deeper in the sand, we uncover an underworld of misfits and misfeasance, murder and mayhem. And reveal the dark lives of the most deadly coastal killers to ever stalk our shores. Stephen Akinmurele, the killer we're talking about today, liked to kill by the sea. Akinmurele was one of the most prolific serial killers in British criminal history, and yet he remains almost unknown. He killed at least 4 elderly women and 1 man, and he killed in a brutal manner, and all before the age of 20. Akinmurele is possibly Britain's least known serial killer. He's certainly one of the most brutal.
So where did this seaside murderer come from? Akinmurele's father was Nigerian, but his mother was from the Isle of Man, and that was why, as a child, when his parents separated, he was brought from Nigeria to the Isle. He was largely raised by his strict grandmother.
And Akinmurele, I believe, developed his passionate hatred of old people.
This passionate hatred of old people ultimately led him to wanting to murder them. In the Isle of Man, he fixated on the retired pensioners who called it home. His first victim was called Marjorie Ashton, and she lived in Ballasalla. Marjorie was a shy and retiring 72-year-old, but this meant nothing to Akinmurele. In May 1995, the teenage Akinmurele stalked her, strangled her, and set her on fire. In doing so, he created his signature as a killer.
As is so often the case with serial killers, they don't have horns or a tail or a big black cloak. They are incredibly ordinary.
Having gotten away with the murder of Marjorie Ashton, Akinmurele was driven to kill again. In February 1996, he strangled 68-year-old Dorothy Harris to death. A teenage arsenal of anger. His fury and loathing against the elderly was now unstoppable. I have no doubt that the contempt for his disciplinarian grandmother was the key to this hatred of the old. But other, deeper psychological factors may also have come into play.
It's not clear whether he hated old people or the idea of getting old himself, or whether it was some form of sexual attraction that he found he was disgusted by.
As a youngster, with difficulties fitting in, he increasingly found himself in trouble. Run-ins with the Manx police would see his own grandmother, that matriarch of the household, scold him. Oh, how he must have hated that. This difficult home life can only have been compounded when his adolescence hit him and he found himself struggling with feelings of homosexuality.
It is unusual, to say the least, to commit two murders at such a young age as a teenager and not be caught. But again, the reality is that the police would not necessarily be looking for a young teenager. They would be looking for an older person who maybe has broken into the house, they're looking at possible burglary that went wrong, and they've killed the victim in the process of the burglary. They're not looking for a young teenager who's going around killing old people.
With two murders behind him, the 18-year-old Akinmurele decides to leave the Isle of Man, partly in fear that he will be identified as a killer, partly also, I suspect, to find pastures, or should we say promenades, new. He liked to kill by the sea, and my goodness, he didn't have to go far. Only just a short trip to Blackpool in Lancashire, where he was to kill again 3 more times. When he arrived in Blackpool, he contrived to blend in, to hide in the plain sight, along with the smell of fish and chips and the candy floss and the piers and the crowds of tourists. It was a perfect place to disguise what he truly had in mind. He went to work in a benefits office, but that wasn't his only job. At night, he worked in a bar called Rumours, which attracted a great many beautiful girls to work as topless waitresses, and an equally large number of men, some of whom clearly came to see the girls, but many of whom may also have come to see Akinmurele.
In those days, literally every night of the week the town centre would be busy. Certainly Thursday, Friday and Saturday, you couldn't move for people.
He was working as a barman in a local sort of fun pub called Rumours, which was very popular back then, and he would be working sort of night shifts there, so into sort of 2 in the mornings when he usually closed, I think. The bar was popular with everybody really, and he would normally have to sort of dress up in sort of shorts and like a waistcoat type thing, which was what the standard dress for the men behind the bar were, and so you had to be quite sort of fit and muscly to do that, or to carry that off really.
There seems to be this side to him that he was kind of basically very active sexually. He was very promiscuous with both sexes, and he basically was really sort of availing himself of everything that he could enjoy in the town. And at the seaside, fun-loving place like Blackpool, it was a great place for him to indulge himself.
I suspect on the Isle of Man his sexuality had to be curtailed to a certain extent, but coming to Blackpool he could be quite actively gay without any moral restraint or anything like that. And as I understand it, he was actually very promiscuous and very active in the gay scene. I suspect there's an element of anxiety and guilt about being gay. He comes from a culture that is very anti-homosexuality. I mean, Nigeria still has some of the most restrictive laws on homosexuality in the world. Being in Blackpool, he would be allowed to be much more sexually active, but at the same time, I suspect there would have been an element of guilt in his behaviour.
Nobody would have suspected he had this secret side to him, because he just came across as a fairly sort of good-looking, attractive, fairly easygoing guy, and he was enjoying himself. He was clearly, loved the party side of the town, but at the same time he had this kind of deep, dark side which he kept hidden from everybody. Very chameleon-like in that respect. As I think some serial killers seem to have that ability to appear to be completely ordinary and delightful in normal company, but then when they've got somebody that they are targeting, then you see the true nature of what they are really like.
Becoming part of the Blackpool nightclub scene and fulfilling his sexual urges at the same time seemed to have quelled Akinmurele's need to kill, but those urges that had lain dormant since his arrival in the town were about to be reawakened and set him on the path to becoming a fully fledged serial killer.
It was to be almost 3 years after his arrival in Blackpool to stay inevitably in a guest house before Akinmurele was to kill again. In October 1999, he dispatched his third landlady, this time in Blackpool. She was called Jemima Cargill. She was 75 years old, and he brutally bludgeoned her. He then, as he'd done on the Isle of Man, set fire to her house.
Whatever semblance of a normal life Akinmurele had carved out for himself in Blackpool was shattered in October 1998. Once again, the elderly became the focus of his wrath, and in Blackpool, with its streets of guest houses and lodgings often run by retired elderly women, he was to find the perfect hunting ground.
The sort of seaside landlady is a staple of old, comedy acts, but there's a bit of truth in there, and a lot of people do turn to letting out their rooms and becoming landladies at a certain point in their life, and Blackpool is the quintessential town for that. Everyone would associate the town with sort of low budget accommodation with those kind of figures who would be running a very homely type of accommodation. A great place for somebody like Akinmurele to sort of, basically effectively corner a rather vulnerable woman on their own.
Most killers flee the scene following the murder. Akinmurele was one of that rare group who did not, choosing to stay behind with the victim, seeking a twisted communion with their corpse.
I have, in the past, come across killers who've stayed in the house after they've killed, simply because they want to enjoy the experience. Some of them even end up having food, eating food from the house that they've killed the victim in. Now, in this case, he seems to have had a food in the house. He seems to have enjoyed actually being with the dead victim.
With Jemima Cargill dead on the floor, Akinmurele helped himself to the food from her refrigerator. Yet, still unsatisfied, he inflicted one further appalling insult against her dignity. He set fire to her house.
Fire setting by certain offenders has got a sexual undertone to it. Criminal history is littered with arsonists who set a fire and then stand back and watch the police and the fire services attend and struggling to put out the flames. In other words, they're admiring their handiwork, they're rubbing their hands with glee, and some of them get sexual satisfaction from it. Now, my opinion is this, and it's only mine, that he hated these elderly people with such a passion. Not only did he want to destroy them and their bodies, but he wanted to destroy their belongings, their property. He wanted to erase them completely. And the only way he could do that was set the place on fire.
Stephen Akinmurele had arrived in Blackpool, a volcano waiting to explode. He was full of rage, full of an incredible incandescent anger at old people, and also an uncertainty about his own sexuality. He was promiscuous, he was deeply bisexual, he effectively was in many ways a sexual maniac. And he focused that anger, unfortunately, on two quiet, nice, gentle people, Eric and Joan Boardman.
Dad was quiet, stayed in a lot. Mum was a little bit more outgoing, but they got on well. Dad used to have a summer job, which was his boat, a pleasure boat on Blackpool Prom, and a winter job, shrimping and being an electrician. And when Mum went with him on the electrical job, she was the one crawling under the floorboards with the wires because Dad was a little bit bulky. She just helped him all she could. When he went shrimping, she went with him 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. And when they went on a pleasure boat, Mum wasn't happy just to be there seeing people on and off. She wanted to know how to sail the boat, and so she got a boatman's licence, and she was the first lady in the Northwest to have a full boatman's licence, not a provisional, a full, and she was very proud of that.
The Boardmans were a genuine seafaring family who were enjoying their retirement in Blackpool. Tragically for them, Akinmurele lived only a few streets away and had seen Joan Boardman going about her daily business. By this time, his own life was in free fall. A growing dependency on drugs and alcohol saw him becoming increasingly removed from reality. He would often be seen pacing around the beach, talking to himself and screaming at the ocean. That sea of rage within would soon engulf him and lead to one of the most brutal double murders ever to take place in a British seaside town. On the eve of Halloween in 1998, Akinmurele chose to pay the Boardmans a visit. This was no social call. He had only murder in mind. Armed with a homemade cosh stuffed into a sock, he gained entry to their house. What followed was an utterly calculated attack aimed at ending the married couple's lives.
He left her at the foot of the stairs, quite possibly to entice the husband down the stairs. We know that he did come down the stairs, probably saw her lying there.
He attacks Eric Boardman with a viciously, and leaves him effectively for dead. But Eric comes round. He hasn't been killed, as Akinmurele thought he was, and he decides to attack Akinmurele. Akinmurele is a huge man, big, bulky, muscular, dramatic, and Eric Boardman was 74 years old. This was a really remarkable thing to do.
Despite Eric Boardman's valiant fight back, eventually Akinmurele overpowered him, ending his life in the most cruel fashion.
He stood on Mr. Boardman's neck and put his hand on the ceiling and literally with force basically squeezed the life out of him.
Now, with the Boardmans lying dead on the floor, Akinmurele set about trying to cover his tracks, attempting to make the crime scene look like an accident. It was into this chaotic scene, on a routine visit to her parents, that the Boardman's daughter Marilyn entered the house.
I walked into the house and it was just like a stage had been set. It was a really strange sensation. Dad was on the floor. I knew it was Dad. I couldn't see his face at first because there was a little wardrobe that they used to keep the winter clothes in on top of him. But I recognised his footwear and I recognised the bottom of his jeans. So I just ran up to him saying, Dad, are you all right? Are you all right? And I tried to move the wardrobe, and it's a very light wardrobe, and I've moved it since, but I couldn't. I think it was just panic. I thought it had just happened at the time, and I thought, Mum will be going frantic. Where is she? Why isn't she in the hall? So I went. They've got 2 rooms leading off the hall. One of them is a spare room where they kept the spare furniture and my mum's washing machine. Well, my mum was always washing, so I thought she'll be in there. So I tried to open the door and it would barely open. It was something stuck in the way. So I kept pushing at it, just to get my head round. And there was no mum until I looked down to see what was blocking the door. I thought, whatever it is, I'll move it. And it was just like a pile of washing. And the top thing was a blue sheet. So I picked the blue sheet up and I just saw an arm sticking out and I recognised my mum's cardigan. So I moved the sheet completely away and found Mum. She was on her back, very slightly to one side, on her back, and she just looked so peaceful, as if she'd just gone to sleep.
Now, at the end of October 1998, Stephen Akinmurele has killed at least 5 people. Akinmurele is utterly out of control, literally like a wild beast. It isn't exactly surprising that once the Boardman's bodies have been discovered by their daughter, that the police in Blackpool realise that they have a serial killer on their hands. This is someone whom you have to stop at once because he is literally out of control. Less than 48 hours after the discovery of the Boardman's bodies by their daughter Marilyn in the blood-spattered hallway of their house, Stephen Akinmurele was arrested by the police. He'd made a foolish mistake. He'd used a homemade cosh of 6 torch batteries bound together with masking tape and, of course, had left his fingerprints on them.
We became involved. Obviously, the family discovered that they'd been murdered at the house. At that stage, we didn't know who was responsible. Found at the premises was a cosh. It's some batteries that had been bound with tape. Constructed in probably about 3 or 4 batteries put together, literally formed a small truncheon, and that's what had been used to attack the Boardmans. That was examined, taken to headquarters, examined, and lo and behold, it revealed the fingerprint of Stephen Akinmurele.
Lancashire Constabulary were fantastic. They did a brilliant job. They said, we've got someone and he's called Stephen Akinmurele and he's 20 years old, which he was at the time. And that was the first we'd heard who it was.
His flat was inside a multi-occupancy dwelling. We forced an entry into the flat and there he was inside the building, inside that particular flat in the living area of it. When we went in, he was actually sat on the settee. He was actually eating a bag of chips at the time. He asked us if he could finish his chips, which I thought I could not believe what I'd just heard. So I actually spoke to him and said, do you understand what we've just said to you? It's clearly important that he understands exactly what we've just said to him. And he was more concerned about his chips than being arrested on suspicion of murder. I don't know who was in more disbelief, me or him, at his response to being arrested. What will stick with me is there was nothing, there was no response from him. When you looked at him, he was emotionless. There was he didn't appear to be scared, didn't appear concerned, he just seemed empty, really. When you looked into his eyes, he was just cold, just nothing there, really, no emotion.
With his record, there's no doubt that he was well and truly in the system, and there was also no doubt that he was banged to rights. But when he finally reached the police station, he had very, very little to say for himself indeed.
We showed him pictures of the house, we showed him a map of the area, and he did say that on that morning he'd been past the house, and he saw the police activity outside the house. Asked him, did he know what was going on? He said he didn't, but he was aware that there was obviously something going on because the police were there. So at that stage, we just said to him, well, okay, have you ever been to the house? And quite fortunate for us, he said, no, I haven't. Well, of course, at that stage, we knew that there was a palm print under the stairs.
During his rageful killing of Mr. Boardman, Akinmurele made a crucial error. as he used his entire body weight to crush Mr. Boardman's neck. He had pushed his hand against the banister and ceiling, leaving behind a clean print of his hand.
We obviously put the evidence to him about the cosh. We put the evidence to him about the palm print under the stairs, but he still wouldn't admit it. He was charged with the 2 murders. There was overwhelming evidence, but he wouldn't admit it. As the day progressed, it was now late, and his solicitor had just left. My colleague had also left, and I was just literally finishing off the paperwork with him. And I just remember looking at him, and I just said, "So where did it all go wrong?" And he said, "There's more." But at that stage, having dealt with quite a significant amount of prisoners, it's a throwaway comment that you get it all the time. He said, "I'll speak to you tomorrow."
After a night in the cells, Akinmurele's attitude to the police altered. He admitted in an interview that he had 1 or 2 other things to tell them.
The following morning, I got a phone call from the custody office to say he wants to speak to you. So I went to see him. He said there was a lady. He didn't know exactly what at that stage, but he said there's a lady who was in a fire. I strangled her and I set fire to her. So at that stage, I said, well, at that stage, and I think you better get your solicitor into the police station.
There was another incident that had been dealt with as an accidental fire by the fire brigade, I think about a week earlier, where the lady in question, I think, had died in a fire on Court Street, and he then confessed to the fact that he was also involved in that offence as well.
Akinmurele stuns the interviewing officers when he tells them that he is responsible for the death of Jemima Cargill. She had been a former landlady of his in Blackpool. He'd set fire to the house, but it was an unexplained death as far as the police were concerned at that point. They assumed that she died of smoke inhalation in the fire. The reality was that he'd killed her before the fire had been set.
Although Akinmurele was now talking to detectives, he was still being highly selective in terms of the information he shared, and he blankly refused to offer any motive for his crimes or why he targeted his elderly victims.
The detectives did tell us that he had given some form of story that he'd gone to that address to carry out a hit on a drug dealer who lived in the top flat at that address, which the detectives, I believe at the stage, suspected that this was a bit of a Walter Mitty tale. I did search that top flat at the address, and it was full of needles and what you would associate with a drug user as opposed to a drug dealer. And from memory, there was nothing significant recovered from there.
With Akinmurele in custody, detectives looked at his early life back on the Isle of Man. The investigation began to focus on any mysterious deaths of elderly women.
Then he told me about a murder that he committed in the Isle of Man. And as with Mrs. Cargill, we needed for him to tell us. So he described a place called Ballasella. I've never been there. In fact, I've never been to the Isle of Man. So literally, from the very beginning, he described the street, the house where it was, the front garden, the door, where the doorbell was, how he got in, the layout of the house, where she'd been. The pub at the bottom of the road. I went for it to work in the Isle of Man to liaise with the Isle of Man CID, and I arrived at the airport. I got picked up by one of the locals, and we were driving down the main road of Ballasella. I didn't know it was Ballasella at that stage, and I said, I've been here before. Because the minute detail that he told me, I could just picture in my mind's eye exactly where it was. I could see the house, I could see the garden, everything fitted. We liaised with the Isle of Man police. Yes, there had been a body found. I think that had been written off as an accident as well. But clearly, again, it was one of Mr. Akinmurele's deeds.
I know he came from the Isle of Man, and I went to the Isle of Man a couple of years later. I couldn't go any sooner, it was too raw. But after a couple of years I went and I spent the day in their library there and looked up Stephen Akinmurele, and he'd been in trouble for menacing elderly ladies many years before. The Isle of Man police maybe should have looked into it when 2 ladies died in mysterious circumstances or questionable circumstances, and he lived fairly close by, that they might have looked into that.
We now know that Akinmurele has killed at least 3 people in Blackpool. It was to emerge that he'd killed 2 elderly ladies in the Isle of Man before arriving in Blackpool. That makes a total of 5 victims. There may even have been more. The question would be, were his victims, however many there were, ever going to get justice? By the time that Stephen Akinmurele was finally arrested in 1999, at the age of just 20, he'd killed 5 people, making him one of the youngest, most prolific serial killers in British criminal history. Even the hardened police officers who took him into custody could not believe just how dangerous he was. It's no exaggeration to say this was a young psychopath on the rampage. One of the reasons that Akinmurele's crimes are so little known is that he cheated justice. The details never went to court because in August 1999, Akinmurele killed himself. He hanged himself in his cell at Strangeways Prison in Manchester. Even though he was on suicide watch, he managed to escape justice.
Well, it was heading towards trial, but I think the closer it got to trial, perhaps from his point of view, he thought that perhaps there was only one way out for him, and he took it. It was a shock, actually. There was no indication that anything like that in any of the conversations that we'd had. He was on suicide watch at Strangeways, but I think that's probably standard rather than anything specific that they could point to. But it was getting nearer to the trial that he committed suicide.
I felt sorry that he'd had to end his life. There's no doubt about that. But had he lived, I wouldn't want him free to do this again to anyone else. When he said he heard voices telling him to do what he did, I do believe him, and I think he was ill, and it's just a sad situation all round. I didn't feel any hatred. I've never felt hatred. I just felt, within a few hours of knowing that he'd been ill, I just felt just very sorry that his life had to follow that pattern.
After his death, 2 notes were discovered on Akinmurele's body. One was a letter to his mother, which read, "I couldn't take any more of feeling like I do now, always wanting to kill." The other was even more terrifying. It said, "I know it's not right, always thinking like this, but murder is always on my mind."
The really unsettling thing about Stephen Akinmurele is that he has himself a victim narrative. He is the victim in all this. That's his underlying storyline. Now, how do I know that? I know that because of the way he talks about fearing that he will kill again. This is classic victim perspective on things. He's abdicating responsibility. There are no rules, no social norms, nothing makes any sense, and they are essentially powerless. That's how they see themselves, operating in the world as powerless, impotent. They are the victim of life, and therefore everything that they do is just something that has been forced upon them that is necessary for them to survive. They can justify anything because they're always the victim.
Despite being one of the UK's most deadly coastal killers, Akinmurele's name and his crimes remain relatively unknown. Perhaps in part because the spotlight was upon another more prolific serial murderer who was also making headlines.
I think it's an interesting case, but I think because it wasn't recognised by the police very quickly, it didn't get a great deal of media attention, and he killed himself before it went to trial, so it didn't get the public interest that it would have.
To this day, speculation remains about why Akinmurele turned to murder and had such a violent hatred of the elderly.
This is a man, a murderer, who has deliberately targeted, killed and targeted the most vulnerable victims, the most fragile group of our society. And yet, somehow he still sees himself as the victim in all this. Stephen Akinmurele doesn't want anybody to believe that he has this avenging agenda against older people. And he's trying to convince other people, and he's trying to convince himself that he doesn't have that particular agenda. Because after all, how can you be the victim in a whole scenario if you have an avenging agenda yourself?
There was nothing that I can recall that particularly meant that he had any sort of grudge against elderly people. I think perhaps the fact that he brought into the equation these extra offences perhaps meant that he wanted to get it off his chest. And I think there was an element of guilt there, and certainly remorse, I think, when he sort of, when questioning and it's put to him that, you know, these people have got families and things, that I think that sort of hit home to him.
The final horrifying irony of Akinmurele's depraved life was that he killed himself on August bank holiday weekend at the height of the summer season.
In the main, the locals of Blackpool were shocked that, yes, we do have murders, a lot of them domestic, but to have a serial killer in their midst, I think was quite shocking, really.
I think the fact that he was just so young. I mean, he had his 21st birthday in Strangeways prison, and it just was just unlike anybody else that I dealt with at that time. So somebody so young, capable of committing so many serious offences.
Think of the elderly, the people who have fought in the wars in this country, respectable people, law-abiding, tax-paying people. Imagine the terror they had when this young man, who came into their homes, smiling, charming and friendly, and turned into a monster.
To think that the last few minutes of their life, they were struggling and knowing they were going to die, that is so hard, because, as I say, all I wanted was them to have a happy life and not have any worries. And it's difficult to think of them, and unfortunately, because that's the last image I have of them, that's what comes into my mind. Even talking about it now, I can't believe my parents have been killed by a serial killer. It's weird, but I realised that he was ill. I don't think he was just utterly evil. I think he had a serious mental problem, and just sad that he had to end his life the way he did. It's just sad all round. I just like to remember them as they were. My mum being very friendly with everybody, And Dad, just being Dad, just remember them as a loving couple.
Join me, Geoffrey Wansell, next time for more Murders by the Sea.